In my own work, my focus is on the Black and African diasporas. I try to use both terms because there is still an ongoing debate in Black and African diaspora studies about whether or not Africa should be the center of the diaspora, in which case we should call it African diaspora studies, or whether one can in fact talk about different Black communities outside of Africa and not use Africa as a central reference point, in which case that would be known as Black diaspora studies. A lot of people use the two terms interchangeably, not knowing that some people see them as picking sides. I try to bring in both to say the jury is out yet. I think we simply need more of everything rather than less of anything. But even in Black and African diaspora studies, there is a radical overrepresentation of one group and inevitably misrepresentations of other groups. And so it made me think about the way in which Black German identities are marginalized and yet so terribly central to understanding different things. When you look at diaspora studies, you'll open up books and websites that claim to be the history of the African diaspora, even documentaries, and what you'll usually find is that the people that are primarily focused on are male, they are heterosexual, and they are usually US-based, and typically the history of that diaspora is the history of the Atlantic slave trade. The decision is that is when the diaspora begins, and it moves from West Africa to the Americas, but of course quite often what you'll find is we bypass one of the largest collectives in the Atlantic area. There are over 100 million Black Brazilians, and we head straight to the southern United States, and this becomes the norm. There are all sorts of types of problems with any kind of overrepresentation, but here, I think the problem that hits me the most is one, strange conundrums that happen. For example, there was a debate at Harvard a few years back about whether or not Harvard should admit Black Caribbean students in such great numbers because, after all, African Americans had undergone slavery. And I had to, and this was in the New York Times, and I had to stop and think, well, where do you think all the Black people in the Caribbean came from? You know, they didn't come over on a cruise ship and just decide to stay because, you know, the weather's nice. But it really showed the degree to which African Americans, to a certain degree, have a monopoly on slavery. There are moments when it's a monopoly, but it's useful because they're obviously, the US has to constantly reckon with its slave past and is constantly trying not to do so, to erase it or either to rename it. So the fact that we have to fight against this, it makes sense that we claim this. But of course, at the same time, in most cases, we leave certain things out, or as I was discussing with a colleague today, we often forget that slavery exists today, that slavery existed before Atlantic slavery. It was one of the most common forms of labor, and it still goes on today. We see it in places such as the Middle East, where you have Black African slaves being bought and sold, but we also have slavery in the United States. We have a lot of agricultural workers who usually come from Central America. They go to work on these plantations. They are not allowed to leave the plantations. They are paid in company scrip, and of course what always ends up on payday is that they owe more money to the company for their crappy bed, for their crappy shelter, for their crappy food, and of course they're forced to stay on. And I worry about the degree to which we are so prone, at least in the West, to imagining slavery as purely on the southern plantation, that we miss the fact that slavery has long been a labor threat and continues today, and we even have these ironic moments where quite often it is those who are poorest who are forced to consume the products of slave labor because those products are so incredibly cheap, whether it is clothing or whether it is fast food. What also happens, of course, with the emphasis on the masculine body as enslaved, especially in the United States, is that racism is often defined as emasculation. Now, most certainly, that happens, and that is a deliberate strategy used by white policemen, by white politicians, an attempt to humiliate the Black male and seek emasculation. But sometimes what ends up getting bypassed in that protest is that there are Black female bodies that are also being sacrificed to the cause of white supremacy, Black queer bodies that are being sacrificed to this cause. And we need to understand racism in a much broader context and move away from the distortions we have